Okay, hi girls. So, as promised, this is for your screenshot for class on Friday. We left off talking about, the last thing we talked about was Brown versus Board of Education. So we talked about sweet little Linda Brown and the Supreme Court case that made segregation in schools illegal. So the court concluded that segregation is inherently unequal, and they overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. So if you got my email, you know that the outline that was on Moodle was actually the wrong outline. That was why there was so much confusion, like with my notes versus y'all's notes. So now I emailed you the correct outline. You actually have more than you need. So you should have everything that's on the new outline already. We did that today, so we'll just pick up where we left off with the Montgomery bus boycott. And this is 1956 in Montgomery, Alabama. And we have segregated buses, so this meant that the African Americans would sit in the back rows of the bus, and whites had the front rows. And it was expected that black people would get up and give their seats to white bus patrons, even if they were there first. They'd be expected to get up and move seats and sit in the back. So Rosa Parks was she was the secretary of the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP, so the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and she was convinced by local civil rights leaders to act. So this is when she refuses to give up her seat when a white man boards the bus. She refuses to get up and go to the back of the bus, and is arrested and sent to jail. And this had some pretty profound effects on the civil rights movement after that. Leaders in the city immediately went to work to organize boycotts of the city bus system, and they issued flyers asking all African Americans not to take the bus. So they felt like this would be super, super effective because 70% of the total ridership of the bus system in Montgomery, Alabama was African Americans, and they just lost 7 out of 10 riders. So that did have a pretty profound effect on the business end of the bus company. We also see Martin Luther King emerging as a civil rights leader. He's very young when he starts getting involved. He's 27 and a minister, and he's actually a minister, not Linda Brown's father. I don't know why I said that, but anyway. So Martin Luther King emerges as this huge figure in the civil rights movement. Obviously, we've all heard of Martin Luther King. A little bit about him. So he grew up in the Great Depression in the 1930s, but his family was actually pretty well off, so he wasn't one of the ones that was terribly affected by the Great Depression. He attended Morehouse College, and then after that, so even though his family's pretty well off, he goes to a tobacco farm to better identify with poor people. So he really wanted to not only talk about those experiences, but he actually wanted to know what it was like to live as a poor person. Then he got his PhD from Boston University when he was 26. That's very young to get a PhD. And then he moved to Montgomery and became the pastor of a very high class, kind of high-end black church. King is going to be famous for following a practice called nonviolent protest and civil disobedience. So what this means, civil disobedience is basically like refusing to obey a law that's deemed immoral. So it's not violent acts. They're not, rioting, and they're just it's peaceful things. It's sit-ins, marches, parades, so non-violent demonstrations. So since those African Americans are not taking the buses, Martin Luther King organized for cars to be driven the regular bus route to pick up people from the bus stops and drop them off at work and at home. So they essentially were the new buses, these cars. So the city naturally comes out with an ordinance saying that the cars have to operate like taxis. So they need a taxi license, and they have to charge people at least 45 cents. And that was more than the bus fare. So they came up with a way to mess up that plan. But then people just walked. So they were refusing to participate in the bus system any longer. And the bus system, they felt threatened by that because they were losing a lot of their business. So the results of the bus boycott are favorable for the protesters, because their goal was actually just to get a permanent dividing line. So basically, like, one side of the bus is for blacks and one side of the bus is for whites. That way, if someone got on, a black person wouldn't have to stand up because they each had their respective sides. So they would never have to give up a seat again. They tried to do that because they thought that would be easier than complete desegregation. But a year later, a judge outlawed segregated buses anyway, so they were actually successful. The boycott was successful. Okay, so that's the Montgomery bus boycott. Now we have the formation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, so the SCLC. So this is formed in January of 1957 by about 60 black ministers. So this is after the bus boycott. The bus boycott was 1956. This is 1957. And Martin Luther King was chosen as the first leader. So he's dedicated to nonviolence and civil disobedience, which is refusing to follow a law because you feel it's immoral. So this becomes an integral organization for voting rights, an end to segregation, and equality for all. So that's a huge part of the civil rights movement, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Okay, so the Little Rock Nine, we're going to talk about, we're going to watch a video about the Little Rock Nine, because this is pretty hard to talk about, because it's young people. It's people that aren't much different in age than we are, and I just can't imagine what they had to go through. So this is 1957 in Little Rock, Arkansas, the pinnacle of culture. And remember, this is after Brown versus Board of Education, so that was in 1954. And now, 3 years later, that case has paved the way for African American students to start entering these formerly all-white schools. So the superintendent in Little Rock comes up with this relatively well-intentioned plan to begin to remember, they said it had to be done with all deliberate speed. So this is 3 years later, so really speedy. Not at all. So he's going to gradually start integrating the schools, and they start by enrolling 9 students that were selected on the basis of attendance and good grades. So, and that's the 9 students that are pictured, the Little Rock Nine. but it looks like it's more than 9, but I'm sure one of those is, that lady looks like a principal. Anyway, and this is Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. So, basically, this, surprisingly, not at all, does not go very well for the Little Rock 9. When they arrive at school, the entrance is blocked. So, the day they're supposed to start school, the governor of Arkansas sends the National Guard troops to block the entrance. And they're also met with segregationists blocking their entrance to school. So these are high schoolers, and they get to school and they're being yelled at by grown men, and National Guards are blocking their entrance to the school. There's a quote from one of the students. Her name's Elizabeth Eckford. She said, "Somebody started yelling, 'Lynch her, lynch her.' I tried to see a friendly face somewhere in the crowd, someone who maybe could help. I looked into the face of an old woman, and it seemed a kind face, but when I looked at her again, she spat on me." So, obviously, President Eisenhower and many others are not pleased with how this went. They're quite upset. And the governor was ordered to disband his National Guard troops and allow the students entry to the school, which he eventually did. But just because they were in the school doesn't mean that tensions didn't die down. The Little Rock police had to guard the front door against the angry mob of segregationists outside, so they're not giving up. And the students were actually snuck through the back door. This is all just to get to high school. This is just to get to class. All this craziness. So when the mob hears that the students are inside, they start rioting. And the students are escorted out again. The mayor of Little Rock asks President Eisenhower for help. And Eisenhower sends in the 101st Airborne Division of the United States Army and placed the Arkansas National Guard under federal command. So the Army is getting these high schoolers into their high school. If you can just imagine that for a second. And on Wednesday, September 25th, 1957, with the protection of the Army and the National Guard, the 9 students entered school. And not surprisingly, they were not treated very well while they were there. Just a couple things. One of them, Melba Patillo, she had acid thrown in her eyes. Another student, Minnie Jean Brown, was verbally confronted and abused. She said, "I was one of the kids approved by the school officials. We were told we would have to take a lot and were warned not to fight back if anything happened. One girl ran up to me and said, 'I'm so glad you're here. Won't you go to lunch with me today?' I never saw her again." Minnie Jean Brown was also tormented by a group of white male students in December in the school cafeteria during lunch. She was called names and bullied. Out of frustration, she dropped her lunch, and it was a bowl of chili, and some of it got on the white students, and she was suspended for 6 days. 2 months later, after more confrontation, Brown was suspended for the rest of the school year. She transferred to another high school in New York City, and there is no record of associated punishment for any of those white students, her antagonists. There's no record of that whatsoever. So I think it's worth being noted that these protesters and these young people that were working to get schools integrated, they were told not to fight back, because when you fight back, supposedly it makes things worse when you respond, which is pretty hard to imagine. But if you've ever seen the movie The Butler, it's a group of protesters, and they're just sitting quietly. It's supposed to be an all-white counter at a restaurant, and they go and they sit at the counter at the restaurant, and they're obviously denied service, but they don't get up. And the white segregationist kind of like angry mob comes in and starts pouring hot coffee on them and yelling in their ears and punching them and just like being very, very aggressive, and then they get arrested. The white people that are throwing boiling coffee on them are not getting arrested. So this is pretty brutal and terrible. Okay, so that's Eisenhower. Now we're going to talk about civil rights under Kennedy, and then we'll call it a day. We're not going to get to finish this, but we'll start a little bit of Kennedy, and then we'll call it a day. So this is civil rights under President John F. Kennedy, and he's the one that we see like really start to step it up with the civil rights movement. Remember, we said Truman was the first one that's an active civil rights supporter, but Kennedy, there's a lot going on civil rights-wise under Kennedy's administration. So this is exactly what I was just talking about, the sit-ins. So this is the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC, and this is an interracial organization made up of mostly college students. So this is mostly young people. And they started out as kind of a faction of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but they wanted a voice of their own. Ella Baker, that's her with the mic, was their leader, and she was famous for holding sit-ins. So like I just talked about, like at the restaurants, you can see that's a white boy and a white girl. They were involved too. There's someone pouring something on her head. You can see they're covered in food. The counters are filthy. I don't know about y'all, but I could not sit there while someone poured something on me and yelled mean names in my ear. That takes a pretty special, strong type of person. I'd probably hit them. So, like I said, sit-ins are basically when black people sat in places where they weren't allowed and refused to leave. So lunch counters were a prime example. And they were often arrested for civil disobedience and met with violence from the segregationists and the police. So this is a quote from John Lewis, and he's a member of the SNCC. He said, "It was a Woolworth," so Woolworth is like a little restaurant, in the heart of the downtown area, and we occupied every seat at the lunch counter, every seat in the restaurant. A group of young white men came in, and they started pulling and beating primarily the young women. They put lighted cigarettes down their backs, in their hair, and they were really beating people. In a short time, police officials came in and placed all of us under arrest. Not a single member of the white group, the people that were opposing our sit-in, was arrested. So, they were trying to hurt these people. It wasn't like, these people have a lot of anger in their hearts. Okay, so Birmingham. And that's that quote. Okay. Birmingham, Alabama was the most segregated city in the South, and profoundly the most dangerous city for African Americans. The KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, I can't even say it, pretty much had a reign of terror over the city, and they claimed to have several members in high positions in the government. Whether or not that's true, but they used their fear anyway. Bull Connor, That's Bull Connor. Sounds like a great guy, right? Bull. So Bull Connor was the police chief in charge of an all-white police force. And he used the police department as a means to oppress the African American community. So basically, he's going to instruct police forces to beat marchers with their nightsticks. So completely unconstitutional, unwarranted beatings for peacefully protesting, which is your right under the First Amendment of the Constitution to peacefully protest. He's going to allow them to release police dogs and allow the dogs to bite. And he's instructing the fire department to release fire hoses on the marchers. And I don't know if you've ever seen those fire hoses that they use to put out fires in tall buildings, but they can strip the bark off trees. So it's not like a garden hose. These are, they can tear off your skin. George Wallace is the governor of Alabama, and he is also an avid segregationist, and he's going to do everything he can to make sure the schools aren't integrated. And he's once quoted as saying that Alabama needed a few first-class funerals to stop integration, meaning a few of these civil rights leaders needed to die, a first-class funeral, so that the civil rights movement would come to a halt. He's famous for saying, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Okay, so I think we can talk about Mr. Shuttlesworth. No, let's do this. Sorry. Okay, so we'll keep going. Sorry. Okay. So April of 1962, there was a series of marches and sit-ins, and the police department pulls out the fire hoses and dogs on them, and a judge issues, that's what we're talking about, a judge issues a statement that there will be no more marches or public protests. So he's just like not worried about the Constitution of the United States. And he says that there will be no more marches or public protests. And King has never broken the law before, but he decides to break the law and to disobey the order, and he goes to jail. And this is when we get the letter from a Birmingham jail, and that's this letter. And I'll actually get a copy and read that to y'all in class, because you can't read that. Okay, so the 16th Street Baptist Church, sadly, it wasn't uncommon for all black churches in Birmingham to be bombed. Birmingham actually was referred to as Bombingham quite often. And the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church was the 21st bombing in 8 years and the 4th in 4 weeks. So that's averaging a bomb a week. Most of them had not been solved, and those that were, the consequences were quite minimal. So on Sunday, September 15th, 1963, police estimate that at least 15 sticks of dynamite were used to blow up the 16th Street Baptist Church. That was filled with at least 400 Americans, at least 80 of them being children. The blast killed 4 young girls and injured about 20, the youngest whom was 11. Ironically, they were heading down to the basement to have a closing prayer on a sermon entitled "The Love That Forgives." And the member of the KKK that was responsible was arrested for having 122 sticks of dynamite without a permit. And he was found not guilty of murder, received a $100 fine, and 6 months in jail for having the dynamite. And that's justice in Birmingham. The African American community began to call on the help of Martin Luther King Jr. because of his work in the community. And he's still in jail, and he starts to organize what would become the Children's March. And this is going to be the last thing that we talk about today. And this is quite terrible. But this is the Children's March. And he didn't really intend on the march to be for children. He was attending a meeting in Birmingham and was kind of talking to the group and seeing their thoughts about joining a protest and standing with him and joining him in this protest. And it was mainly the children that stood up and wanted to join him, and people were shocked by this, including Martin Luther King. And he says that the children were too young. Some people were saying the children were too young. And another speaker, his name's James Bevel, posed the question, are they too young to go to segregated schools? Are they too young to be kept out of amusement parks? Are they too young to be refused a hamburger at a restaurant? And the crowd responded that no, they weren't. And Reverend Bevel responded, then they are not too young to want their freedom. So it seemed to make sense to have the children march. Adults had different fears. They were afraid of losing their jobs. They have responsibilities. If an adult goes to jail, they have kids at home, they have jobs they might lose. The children had nothing to lose, and they seemed more interested in their freedom. So why might that be? Just, to yourself think, why would kids be more open to this and less afraid? And then what effect would watching children being hauled to jail have on the rest of the nation? So that's something to keep in mind. On the first day of the march, at least 1,000 children and young adults were marching and then hauled off to jail. So these little bitty kids hauled off to jail. The second day, more showed up. Same thing happens. Third day, same thing. More are hauled off to jail. And eventually, over 1,000 kids are in jail. On the second and the third day, fire hoses and dogs were released on the children. So just a question for y'all, how would that affect the nation's conscience? So these are young children that are being blasted with fire hoses strong enough to strip the bark off a tree. And also, what type of country would allow this to be done to children? We're not that type of country, but we're acting like that. So it's a nightmare. So business owners were willing to negotiate because of the media. So not because it's terrible, but because of the image that they have. It's hurting their businesses, and they don't want the nation to keep insulting them. This very enlightened culture in Birmingham, Alabama, doesn't want to be mistreated by the rest of the nation. I'm being so sarcastic. So the Children's March is sometimes called the Children's Crusade, and it exposes Bull Connor. He's the sheriff in Birmingham. It exposes him as he's not a law enforcer, he's a thug, and he's a racist bigot. He's just terrible. The children aren't committing crimes, and the authorities are the ones that are acting like criminals, and the world can see that now. So before the Children's March, Kennedy kind of regards civil rights as a local issue. But now, with all this media attention, he is going to expose America to the ugly, violent situations that are really going on. So when MLK is arrested for the children's protest, Kennedy's going to make a call to the jail to get him released. And the original purpose of the Children's March was to desegregate stores in downtown Birmingham, but what actually happened was Martin Luther King got a global stage and a good bit of leverage to make more demands, and the country, not the South, but the country in general, was starting to become more united under civil rights. Okay, so Tuesday we'll start with Freedom Rise. Y'all have a good weekend. I'll miss y'all.